right. We left off in Judges chapter 6. If you'll be turning in your Bibles there, that is what we will be looking at this morning. Judges 6. And this is really the story of Gideon that we have in front of us. And we saw how Israel has once again done evil in the sight of the Lord. And this time the Lord has sold them into the hands of the Midianites. And the Midianites are oppressing Israel. They're largely stealing their crops. And the people cry out to the Lord, and the Lord sends a prophet and basically says, you're in this mess because of your sin. Look at all the things I've done for you in the Exodus, and by response, what have you done for me? Well, you've not obeyed me. But after that statement, we get kind of an abrupt transition to Gideon. And Gideon is threshing out wheat in the wine press, which is kind of an odd place to be doing that because normally you would do that in the fields. But he's doing it because he's afraid of the Midianites. It says in verse 11, he was doing this to save it from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appears to him and says, the Lord is with you, O valiant warrior. And, well, Gideon kind of sees this as odd, considering that he's doing something rather cowardly at the time. And really what follows is a scene that is very similar to the call of Moses. There's a lot of protesting about how I can't do this. Yes, you can. I'm reassuring you. I will be with you. You're supposed to deliver my people. Just as Moses was recruited by God, by an angel of the Lord's appearance, to go and deliver Israel from the Egyptians, Gideon is now being recruited by the angel of the Lord to go and deliver Israel from the Midianites. But one final thing that happens in that scene that we didn't really look at too closely last time is this sign that Gideon requests. Gideon says in verse 17, if now I have found favor in your sight, show me a sign that it is you who speak with me. Please do not depart from here until I come back to you and bring out my offering and lay it before you. And he said, I will remain until you return. Now, how should we understand Gideon's request for a sign? Well, let me ask, should we interpret this as, a lot of people interpret this as a lack of faith. Should we be reading it that way? Okay, God didn't seem to read it that way.
Well, I'm thinking of the example of John the Baptist. He was a forerunner of Christ.
Okay.
But yet, when he was about to lose his head, he sent his disciples to Christ and said, are you really the one we're looking for, or look for us? And some people I've heard lambast John for that. Immediately, none greater has been born of women than John the Baptist.
Good.
There are times we ask for signs that are not a lack of faith, but they're a test of purity. This is really God talking.
Good. Yes. Gail. Okay. Right. Okay. Good. And I think this is right. It is common in the Old Testament and in the New Testament for prophets to present their message with some kind of sign. It's not... Here's the real thing. We remember from studying Isaiah, Hezekiah asked for a sign from the Lord. He's not rebuked for that. You know who is rebuked in Isaiah? The guy who wouldn't ask for a sign from the Lord. Ahaz in Isaiah chapter 7. So there's an interesting twist. The only time that anybody in the Bible is rebuked for asking for a sign is in the New Testament when the Pharisees demand signs after they've already been given. It's like, well, I know you can multiply bread, Jesus, but what sign do you really give us? Come on. And then Jesus says, no, you're a wicked generation. You're asking for a sign after all this stuff has happened. Furthermore, Jesus informs everybody that there will be a sign. Tear down this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. John chapter 2. No sign will be given but the sign of Jonah. Matthew chapter 16. The disciples, interestingly, when the disciples are asking about the destruction of Jerusalem, one of the things they ask for is, what will be the sign? Jesus doesn't rebuke them for that. He tells them what it is. Reading Matthew 24 is kind of a tantalizing and confusing thing at first. So, it's kind of hard to decipher what the sign is, but he does give them a sign. All of this to say, I don't think we should be hard on Gideon for asking for a sign. He does the right thing here. Gideon has a lot of other flaws we're going to look at later, but this isn't one of them. So Gideon goes, he prepares a young goat, unleavened bread from an ephah of flour. He put the meat in a basket and the broth in a pot and brought them out to him under the oak and presented them. The angel of God said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread, lay them on the rock. pour out the broth. And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. Then the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. Gideon saw that he was the angel of the Lord. He said, "Alas, O Lord God, for now I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." The Lord said to him, "Peace to you, do not fear, you shall not die." Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and named it "The Lord is Peace." To this day it is still in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Okay, so what happens here, Gideon attempts to bring the messenger a gift. I don't think Gideon intends this initially as a sacrifice. This is the same word that's used for gift. It's used for grain offering somewhere, but it's also used of the gifts that Jacob gives to Esau in Genesis chapters 32 and 33. Or the gifts that Joseph's brothers give to Joseph in Genesis 43. He's probably just demonstrating hospitality like the Abraham or the other patriarchs did. But then the angel burns the meat with miraculous fire and vanishes in the thin air. And you're kind of, I've just seen something that isn't exactly human. He saw the angel of Yahweh, and he's afraid. I've seen the angel of Yahweh face to face. I've seen his messenger. But God reassures him in verse 23, "You will not die." And Gideon builds an altar on that occasion. And so that's the basic scene where Gideon is called. Does anybody have any observations or questions about this part? Okay. Verse 25, God gives Gideon some instructions before he can lead the people. On the same night, the Lord said to him, "Take your father's bull and a second bull, 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal, which belongs to your father, and cut down the Asherah that is beside it. And build an altar to the Lord your God on the top of this stronghold in an orderly manner. And take a second bull and offer a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah, which you shall cut down." Then Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as the Lord had spoken to him. Because he was too afraid of his father's household and the men of the city to do it by day, he did it by night. When the men of the city arose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was torn down, and the Asherah which was beside it was cut down, and the second bull was offered on the altar which had been built. They said to one another, "Who did this thing?" And when they searched about and inquired, they said, "Gideon, the son of Joash, did this thing." The men of the city said to Joash, "Bring out your son that he may die, for he has torn down the altar of Baal. And indeed he has cut down the Asherah which was beside it." But Joash said to all who stood against him, "Will you contend for Baal, or will you deliver him? Whoever will plead for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because someone has torn down his altar." Therefore on that day he named him Jerubbaal, that is to say, "Let Baal contend against him, because he had torn down his altar." All right, so Gideon's first act as a judge of Israel is to tear down the altar of Baal. And this kind of bookends his life a little bit, because the last thing he does that we read about is setting up an idol in the same city, in Ophrah. He sets up an ephod and becomes a snare to the people of his household. But here, this is a good thing he does, although he's... we have a couple of problems going on here. First of all, who owns this altar? Gideon's father owns this altar. So, right here you're defying parental authority over the idolatry issue. And there's precedent for that. The law of Moses said technically that if any, that while you're supposed to honor father and mother, in Deuteronomy 13, if a family member tries to convince you to go serve other gods, they are to be put to death. You are to tattle on them and rat them out. And in its place, Gideon instructs them to build an altar to God in its place. The Asherah pole, which was usually made of wood, would become would become wood for the burning of the burnt offering. God didn't specify a time when Gideon was supposed to do this. We know that God appears to Gideon at night, and on the one hand, Gideon does it right away. But the text specifically tells us that he did it at night because he's afraid and he doesn't want to get killed in broad daylight. Wouldn't you? If you start tearing down the altar in broad daylight. And what happens, of course, is there's a whodunit in the morning, and everybody knows who did it. Gideon did it. They figure it out pretty quick, so doing it at night didn't exactly protect him from the knowledge of the townspeople. The townsfolk come out with tar and feather and pitchforks. They want Gideon dead. They say, "He desecrated our idol." One thing I can say, what do we know about Baal worship? Oh, okay. Right. Yeah, there's definitely that advantage. You're right. The townsfolk's reaction is kind of interesting. Ramona, you got something? That's a good question. I mean, the text says he was afraid, and maybe this is indicative of a lack of faith on his part in some way. Because, the Bible, fear is almost always the opposite of faith.
I don't know. I don't really.
Well,
I don't know. Okay,
it's unqualified.
Don't agree or disagree. But bravery is good. Now, Elijah had to be afraid. Mount Carmel opposed how many prophets of Baal?
450.
You say Baal, I say
Baal, actually, but yeah. I'm just saying Baal to be nice, accommodative.
So, he did it anyway, even though he was afraid. He did it. Now, God's providence doesn't always work by miracle. So, it could have been in God's providence that God knew he was doing it. And, like you say, doing it at night meant that nobody came and opposed him while he was in the middle of the act. He got it done before anybody could stop him by force. So, I don't think what God said, I don't think we have a real issue there with it. I think that's God's in.
Right, and this is something I think we need to be aware of, that the book of Judges will do frequently, is the book of Judges doesn't always tell you about the why of something. In this case, it does tell you the why. It tells you that Gideon was afraid. But the guy who's whoever wrote this story is telling us events, and he's not really offering a lot of commentary on them. Occasionally he'll say Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, or something like that. But, we'll read the story of Gideon fleecing God, and the author of Judges won't say, well, this is a good thing that he did that, or that was a bad thing that he did that. We're kind of left to go, wait, what was that? How are we to interpret that? We're left to sort of think about it on our own. It's interesting to me that we've got, on the one hand, yes, they can't stop him while he's doing it if he does it in the middle of the night. God commanded him to do this at night. In verse 25, we learn that it was nighttime when the Lord commanded him to do it. Gideon does it right away. But on the other hand, we learn that Gideon's afraid. Maybe he did the right thing for the wrong reason. I couldn't tell you. I don't know. This is one of those things that we're kind of... we're stuck with what the text tells us on this point. And... Lots of interesting points we could make. But the townsfolk's yes.
Go ahead, finish.
No, I'm moving on to the next point. You got something to say?
Answer your question about what
Yes, the townsfolk's reaction. What do we know about Baal worship?
Well, he didn't really care. National, Zeus or Zeus probably some form he did. Mine. He didn't care if he worshipped these other gods. Fine with it. And he was also a god of pleasure. Whatever made them. And Paul was happy with that. Mm-hmm. So he was kind of
Baal worship is very it's very pluralistic. It's kind of like, oh, we don't care if you worship Yahweh as long as you worship Baal too. Elijah indicts the people for this in 2 Kings 18. He says, how long are you going to stray between these two opinions? If Yahweh is God, serve Him. If Baal is God, serve him. But stop playing this game with yourselves. But the truth is that it was built into the Baal religion that, oh no, you can worship just anybody. We accept everybody. We're a religion of tolerance. Of course, here that's apparently only true until you do something they don't like. Boy, nobody today acts like that. I know that for the idolaters' punishment that they demand is the one that they themselves deserved. They're saying, oh, bring Gideon out that we can put him to death. Well, the law of Moses specifies that those who worship Baal are to be put to death. Those who worship idols are to be put to death. But in this community, it's the opposite of the way it should be. And in this community, instead of the idolaters being put to death, we have a group of people saying, bring out your son and let's execute him. Interesting, they assumed that he would do that. And Joash, Gideon's father, what does he say? What do we think of his answer?
Right. maybe this altar was built on the property built it. Answer. I think that would be a probability. It seems like he didn't care too much about this altar. Apparently it was on his property.
Either that or he's picking his son over his faith, which, I mean, you see that all the time. So, yeah.
God said, the real God, take care of himself.
Right. Yeah. Gail. Let Baal take care of him. Jerubbaal, let Baal contend. I mean, it's basically, does Baal need a defense attorney? Does Baal need a savior? You know, instead of people needing deliverance from a hostile God, which, I mean, apparently this is what, you know, you knock over a God's altar, what do you expect is going to happen to you? You expect that the God is going to come and smite you. But no, the people don't need to be saved from that hostile God. What do they need to do? They need to go save their own God. There's something a little backwards about that, don't you think? And this is the idea. It's the folly of idolatry. If Baal is really God, he can fight for himself. In a way, this is similar to Gamaliel's argument in Acts chapter 5. You know, if this really comes from God, don't fight it or you're going to be fighting against God. And if it comes from men, it'll go away on its own. Even though he owned the altar, Joash actually threatens to kill anyone who acts in Baal's place. Jenna. That's a good point. The law of Moses never actually specified this, which Joash doesn't seem like a law well-read in the law of Moses, I'm guessing, if he's got a Baal altar on his property. But it is something to think about and contemplate for a second. You know, that, I mean, does Baal need your help? Well, no, he doesn't. Now, it's one thing if God says, here are the instructions, what I want you to do when someone disobeys me. You need to take care of it in this way. It's altogether another thing when, you know, we decide, oh, well, you know, God needs our help. Oh, God can't do this without me. I'm so special and all that. Well, there's a whole problem there. And this is the mentality they have about Baal. Some people have constructed this reality about God for themselves too. You can see it in some of the songs we sing, like Christ has no hands but our hands. I never miss an opportunity to take a jab at that. But I mean, that's the idea. If Baal is really God, he could fight for himself. Yahweh, he really is God, and he really does fight for himself. But he also gives his people, sometimes he works through the people or through the law, like you said, Jenna. And sometimes, you know, he works on his own when no one will keep the law. He still acts. Yes, Jen? Yeah, that's another irony in that story. 1 Samuel 5. Dagon falls over and they have to pick him up because he can't pick himself up. And, you know, this is kind of a jab at the folly of idolatry here. Now, yeah, exactly how we understand Joash's attitude. I mean, the name Jerubbaal, for instance, sometimes it's interpreted to mean let Baal contend, but grammatically it could more likely be saying Baal will contend, which, if that's the case, you know, Gideon's father is basically saying that, you know, Baal's going to smite you because you did this. And that's possible as well. And actually, grammatically, it's probably more likely that this name reflects a pro-Baal stance, as if Gideon's father actually expects Baal to come through on this point. Okay. Anything down to verse 32. Verse 33. All the Midianites and the Amalekites and the sons of the east assembled themselves, and they crossed over and camped in the valley of Jezreel. So the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and the Abiezrites were called together to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, and they also were called together to follow him, and he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they came up to meet him, to meet them. And Gideon said to God, if you will deliver Israel through me as you've spoken, behold, I will put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I will know that you will deliver Israel through me as you've spoken. And it was so. When he arose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he drained the dew from the fleece, a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, do not let your anger burn against me, that I may speak once more. Please, let me make a test once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, and let there be dew on all the ground. And God did so that night, for it was dry only on the fleece, and dew was on all the ground. Gideon fleeces God here. How are we to understand this story? Gideon's asking for more signs.
Well, nothing.
Correct.
Right thing.
Am I really doing the right thing?
Maybe ask instead of, are you really God? He may have been testing himself and
Well, no, he says in verse 30, well, I get the impression he's testing God, verse 39, but, how do we deal with that? Gail. So he's asking signs to confirm two different things. That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but, that's possible. Now, there's something else. There's another element to this. Gideon, if Gideon's living in this pluralistic pagan society, and he just tore down Baal's altar, there's about a bajillion things that Baal is the god of in mythology, but one of the things that's pretty consistent is Baal being the storm god, or the guy who controls the rain and the dew. Now, if Gideon has just destroyed the altar of the god of the dew, the request for dew to behave in specific ways becomes a little more interesting. A way of demonstrating whether Yahweh has truly triumphed over Baal, perhaps. Did I just do the right thing by tearing down that guy's altar? He's not the god of the dew. I am. So there may be kind of a test going on in that respect as well. That's just a thought. And there's more, I guess, we could say about that. But oh no, not at all.
the guy that's basically literate, probably right, and read the law. Most people actually
Yeah.
may or may not prove. But possibility that he's trying to make sure the right thing to do. He doesn't know the law.
Well, yeah, regardless of what else we've got here, it's interesting. The Spirit of the Lord comes on Gideon in verse 34 before this happens. He has the Spirit of God on him, and yet he still does this. And God still obliges him. At the very least, if people want to, I don't think we should be too hard on Gideon, again, for asking for signs. If people want to do that, then, they've got to deal with the fact that God actually gave him the signs and actually helped him out in that respect.
Are any of the last
Do they function in the capacity of priests? Eli, yeah. It's tricky. You have to sort of, you have to wrestle with the fact, first of all, that, you have to wrestle, first of all, with the fact that, the priests are not necessarily, that we're not totally sure what the office of a judge was. Sometimes, because sometimes they don't appear to have been, a lot of what we see these guys doing doesn't appear to be judging. Maybe Samuel, maybe Deborah. But, a lot of them is just they're deliverers who come and fight. Samson doesn't appear to have any kind of administrative role whatsoever. He just, he goes around and beats up Philistines. He's called a judge of Israel. The word judge is probably not a great translation to begin with. Now that gets into a whole other discussion that will probably take us down a long rabbit path and eat up the rest of our time here this morning. But
my point was that the largest part well educated, not the ones that should have been people in right.
yeah, I want to be careful about saying that only the Levites had, understanding of the law. But yeah, I get what you're saying, though. But no, Gideon would have been from the tribe of Manasseh, I think. Manasseh? Yes, he's from the tribe of Manasseh. And that the main tribe that answers the call in verse 35. And we also see Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali gather together. Okay. Now, they've gathered this big army together. And not a great chapter division, but chapter 7, verse 1, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him, rose early and camped beside the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was on the north side of them, by the hill of Moreh in the valley. Now, we don't learn this until much, much later in the story, but the size of the Midianite army is 135,000 swordsmen. We learn that later on in Judges chapter 8 in verse 10. So the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are, what do you normally expect to follow that sentence? They're too few. But no, that's not what he says. He says, the people who are with you are too many for me to give Midian into your hands. For Israel would become boastful, saying, my own power has delivered me. Therefore come, proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is afraid and trembling, let him return and depart from Mount Gilead. So 22,000 people return, but 10,000 remain. That means that at the start, there's only 32,000 Israelites. And if we want to do some math here, that means Midian outnumbers Israel by more than 4-1. I think I'm doing the math right. Yes, more than 4-1. And God says, most battle situations, are you going to take this group out to battle? Are you going to take this group out to battle this group if you're a general? No. And God says, we can't do this battle yet. The army's too big. We're going to make it smaller. You can't boast about, because I don't want you boasting that you did this by your own might. Maybe you'll interpret it as a fluke or something if you win at 4-1 odds. So no, we've got to whittle the army down. So 32,000, 22,000 go away. We only have 10,000 left. Which means we now are outnumbered by more than 13-1. Oh boy, this is going to be an exciting battle. No hope there, right? That's surely enough to prove God's glory, right? But the Lord said to Gideon in verse 4, the people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. Therefore it shall be that he of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, he shall go with you. But every one of whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, you shall separate everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, as well as everyone who kneels to drink. The number of people who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people kneeled to drink water. And the Lord said to Gideon, I will deliver you with the 300 men who lapped, and will give the Midianites into your hands. So let all the other people go, each man to his home. So the 300 men took the people's provisions and their trumpets into their hands. And Gideon sent all the other men of Israel, each to his tent, but retained the 300 men. And the camp of Midian was below him at the valley. So, no, this is too much. We want to do 300. Excuse me. And if we're doing the math again, we now are outnumbered by a factor of 450-1. The Midianites outnumbered the Israelites, 450 of them to 1 of the Israelites. Now, exactly what we do with this test, where they go down to the water and some of them cup their hands and drink water, which was a very small minority apparently, and the rest of them just kind of bend over and drink out of the water with their face. We can speculate about why that test was put there. Maybe it was them being alert. The guys who bent down to drink would have had to discard their weapons and ignore their surroundings, whereas the other guys are more watchful. I don't know. Maybe it was just arbitrary. Maybe God just decided to pick the smaller number, just because. I do find it interesting, though, that just as Gideon arranged a water test for God at the end of chapter 6, God arranges a water test for Gideon's army in chapter 7. Just as Gideon tested God twice, God whittles his army down twice. It's like, every time Gideon tests God, God ups the stakes a little bit, you might say.
God doesn't like
God has to have a sense of humor. There's no way. It's if God doesn't have a sense of humor, how do you explain the platypus? I'm just saying. Okay. All right. So, if Israel wins this battle, they're not going to be chalking it up to their own skills. No, they're going to have to... they've got suicidal odds here. They have to give credit to Yahweh, who gives the Midianites into their hands. All right, now verses 9 through 14. It came about, the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hands. But if you are afraid to go down, go with Purah, your servant, down to the camp. You will hear what they say. And afterward your hands will be strengthened that you may go down against the camp. So he went down with Purah, his servant, down to the outpost of the army that was in the camp. And now the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the sons of the east were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And when Gideon came, behold, a man was relating a dream to his friend. And he said, behold, I had a dream. A loaf of barley bread was tumbling into the camp of Midian, and it came to the tent and struck it so that it fell, and turned it upside down so that the tent lay flat. His friend replied, this is nothing less than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, the man of Israel. God has given Midian and all the camp into his hand. Now that's kind of cool. It's like, Gideon doesn't even ask for this one. God says, if you're still afraid, I'm going to give you another sign. Go down to the camp and listen to what they're saying. What they're saying is they're having bad dreams. And they're having bad dreams about how Gideon's going to come and destroy them. Well, so what? Coincidence? Well, no. What we have here is an instance where God has actually given people dreams to intimidate them and terrify Israel's enemies. Now, we see this kind of thing elsewhere in Scripture. God uses dreams to communicate with foreigners like Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar. On occasion, we'll see that God will even mess with a pagan divination practice to get the result he wants. In Ezekiel 21, there's an instance where the pagans thought they could tell the future by cutting open an animal and looking at its liver. In Ezekiel 21, there's an instance where God says, Nebuchadnezzar is making a decision about what city he's going to attack. He cuts an animal open, he looks at the liver. I've made it so he's going to attack Jerusalem. God actually manipulates the divination process so that Nebuchadnezzar goes and attacks Jerusalem anyway. And it's the point he makes to Israel. He says, I'm using their methods to destroy you. God takes a nation that is just totally devoid of knowledge in Him and still influences the outcome of their decisions. And that's what's going on here. Midianites have a dream. They don't even recognize Yahweh as God. They have a dream and we're afraid. God has given us into the hands of Gideon. Well, the battle plan, great strategy here. Gideon heard the account of the dream and its interpretation. He bowed in worship. He returned to the camp of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord has given the camp of Midian into your hands. He divided the 300 men into 3 companies. He put trumpets and empty pitchers into the hands of all of them, with torches inside the pitchers. And he said to them, look at me and do likewise. And behold, when I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I and all who are with me blow the trumpet, then you also blow the trumpets all around the camp and say, for the Lord and for Gideon. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, when they had just posted the watch, and they blew the trumpets and smashed the pitchers that were in their hands. And when the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers and held the torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands for blowing, and cried, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon, each stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran, crying out as they fled. And when they blew 300 trumpets, the Lord set the sword of one against another, even throughout the whole army. And the army fled as far as Bethshittah toward Zererah, as far as the edge of Abel Maholah by Tabath. The men of Israel were summoned from Naphtali and Asher and all Manasseh, and they pursued Midian. Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, come down against Midian, and take the waters before them as far as Bethbarah and the Jordan. So all the men of Ephraim were summoned, and they took the waters as far as Bethbarah and the Jordan. They captured the 2 leaders of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and they killed Zeb at the winepress of Zeb, while they pursued Midian, and they brought the hands of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon from across the Jordan. Now that battle strategy sounds a little weird to you. It sounds a little weird to me too. It's very similar to what they do at Jericho. It's absurd. It's not going to work. And yet it does work because God is the one that fights for Israel. They're each given a trumpet, an empty pitcher, and a torch. Nothing said about giving them weapons, I guess. And we're told to act like Gideon. Blow the trumpets at the appointed time. They're to shout for Yahweh and for Gideon. Or more likely what they're really shouting is belonging to Yahweh and to Gideon. The sword belongs to Yahweh and to Gideon, subsequently is idiomatic for the battle belongs to the Lord and to Gideon. The Midianites are defeated. How are they defeated? Well, what do they do? They kill each other. Yeah, they take their swords and they run each other through. The army flees. They're terrified by whatever psychological warfare, this intimidation this brings upon them. God makes them kill each other because the sword does not belong to Israel and the sword does not belong to Midian. The sword belongs to Yahweh. He is the one who is in charge of this situation. So the army from before is summoned to pursue and kill the Midianites. In verse 23 we see that some of these leftover guys from these earlier segments are actually being summoned to kill the Midianites now. And again, there's no commentary on that, but some people interpret that to mean that what's really going on is Gideon has stopped relying on the Lord fully and started relying a little bit more on his own thing. I'm just throwing that out there. I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm saying that interpretation is out there. You have something, Mark?
routed and they're running now. Take the river, take the places that they pass out of, mop up.
Right.
I mean, the battle's done.
The battle is over.
So that help us mop up.
Now they kill Oreb and Zeb, coincidentally, at the places that are named after them. Probably anachronistic. How did they get those names? Well, they got those names because that's where they killed them. And then we get to chapter 8. Now, chapter 8, I do think portrays Gideon in a less positive light, especially towards the end of the picture. We need to realize that Gideon is not a perfect man, and he does some things that aren't necessarily right. But first of all, in verses 1 through 3, we see that the Ephraimites are not happy about the situation. They say to him, "What is this thing you have done to us, not calling us when you went to fight against Midian?" They contended with him vigorously. But he said to them, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has given the leaders of Midian, Oreb, and Zeb into your hands. What was I able to do in comparison with you?" And then their anger toward him subsided when he said that. So the Ephraimites are upset. "Gideon, you didn't call us to fight with you." In spite of the request he gives them in chapter 7 and verse 24, like the angry naysayers after a meeting who choose to get mad because they were not included in the decision-making process. Well, this is what's going on here. Gideon points out how blessed the Ephraimites are. What are you complaining about? You've got all this going on. You've got so much going for you. And points out that you even did participate by killing Oreb and Zeb. So there's a problem here. The Ephraimite complaint is silly and illegitimate, and later on, Ephraim's going to make a similar complaint in Judges chapter 12. And it's going to be a lot more violent when that happens, because Jephthah says, "That's it. I've had enough of you." They tries to kill them. He sets up that whole Shibboleth test at the rivers of the Jordan to let people cross over. In verses 4 through 12, we have Gideon pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna. Gideon and the 300 men who were with him came to the Jordan and crossed over, weary yet pursuing. He said to the men of Succoth, "Please give loaves of bread to the people who are following me, for they're weary, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." The leaders of Succoth said, "Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hands, that we should give your bread to your army?" Gideon said, "All right, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, then I will thrash your bodies with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars." He went up from there to Penuel and spoke similarly to them. The men of Penuel answered him just as the men of Succoth had answered. So he spoke also to the men of Penuel, saying, "When I return safely, I will tear down this tower." Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, and their armies with them, about 15,000 men, all who were left of the entire army of the sons of the east. For the fallen were 120,000 swordsmen. Gideon went up by the way of those who lived in tents on the east of Nobah and Jogbehah, and attacked the camp when the camp was unsuspecting. When Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them and captured the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the entire army. One thing we need to note here, Gideon is still leading his band of 300. And while Oreb and Zeb have been killed, there's still two kings of Midian that need to be dealt with. Succoth refuses to help. Succoth is a city east of the Jordan. Gideon asked they've crossed over the Jordan at this point, and they're going east of the Jordan to pursue the Midianites. Succoth says, "You haven't finished the job yet. Why should we help you?" And so Gideon says, "Okay, well fine, since you won't help me, when I get done doing the job without you, I'm going to come back and beat you with thorns and briars." We see that the tribes east of the Jordan are less willing to help out than those west of the Jordan. He comes to Penuel, same thing. Nobody wants to help Gideon finish the fight. So Gideon says, "All right, when I come back, I'm going to tear down your defensive tower." This is interesting in and of itself. One thing I would note is that this unwillingness on the east side of the Jordan suggests that Israel truly has become fractured by the Jordan River. They kept insisting in Joshua 22 that, well, no, we want to be one nation. We want to make sure that we stay together, and we've set up a witness for ourselves. But apparently, you start to see the seams breaking a little bit here in chapter 8 of Judges. So that's interesting to note as well. Now, Gideon's punishment of Succoth and Penuel will have to wait till next time because we are out of time. We will pick up with that. Does anybody have any observations, comments, or questions? I know I'm kind of blazing through some of this. Not well, we'll pick up next time, Judges chapter 8, and look at the punishment of Succoth and Penuel.